Everybody, welcome. We are in the middle of a study called Lesser Known People of the Bible, and we're going to go to Jeremiah chapter number 38 today. We're going to talk about a man named Ebedmelech, and that's probably a name you've never heard of before. He is one of the truly lesser known people of the Bible. Even some of the folks we've already talked about, Moses' father in law Jethro, you may have heard of him, or Ananias, the man who spared the life of Saul of Tarsus, helped him regain his sight, won him to Christ, and then baptized him. He's someone you may have come across before. But deep in the middle of the book of Jeremiah here, just for a few verses, we find this man, Ebed-Melech, and he saves the life of Jeremiah. So turn your Bibles to Jeremiah 38 with me. I'm going to read about half the chapter, I think, here or so, and cover this unique individual, this courageous man. So, Jeremiah 38, verse number 1. A lot of names here. I might not do well by them, but I'll try. Then Shephatiah, the son of Mattan, and Gedaliah, the son of Pashur, and Jucal, the son of Shelemiah, and Pashur, the son of Malchiah, heard the words that Jeremiah had spoken unto all the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, He that remaineth in this city shall die by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence. But he that goeth forth to the Chaldeans shall live, for he shall he shall have his life for a prey, and shall live. Thus saith the Lord, The city shall surely be given into the hand of the king of Babylon's army, which shall take it. So that's Jeremiah's message. In fact, that's not a new message. If you've ever read or studied the book of Jeremiah, you've seen that given all throughout the book. He says that those who are left in Jerusalem, when Babylon comes, Nebuchadnezzar sends his army in for the final wave of the captivity. There were 3 waves of it. Then you're going to see that you're going to die one of 3 ways. You'll die by the sword, or by famine, or by pestilence. So either the army coming in will slaughter you, or you will go hungry and starve to death because there's no food and no farmers, or you're going to be killed by disease because of these things that are going on. So if you want to live, Jeremiah says, go into captivity, into Chaldea with Nebuchadnezzar and his men. So he's saying, don't fight it. And why is he saying that? Because it's the will of God. This is God's pronounced judgment on Israel for their idolatry and paganism. And he says, you're not going to fight this one. God is going to definitely take captive all of Israel. So if you want to live, submit to that. Let yourselves be taken into Babylon. Well, these patriotic Israelites, they don't want to do that. They're not willing to lay down without a fight. So verse 4, these princes, therefore the princes said unto the king. The princes mentioned are the ones from verse number 1 and verse number 1. Now, they go to the king. The king is Zedekiah. Zedekiah's ignorant, he's foolish, and he's even lacking in courage, as we'll see as we go through this story. Therefore the princes said unto the king, We beseech thee, let this man be put to death. For thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war that remain in this city, and the hands of all the people, in speaking such words unto them. For this man seeketh not the welfare of this people, but the hurt. So they make a valid point to King Zedekiah. Hey, Jeremiah's message is disheartening our army. Those soldiers, it's taking the wind out of their sails. They don't need to listen to this negative talk. They need to be encouraged. Except Jeremiah is the sent prophet by God to the people to tell them. So all of them should actually be listening to him and not resisting his message and fighting. So these princes say, hey, what I want you to do, king, is let's kill Jeremiah. Let's put him to death. And so what does Zedekiah say? Verse 5. Then Zedekiah the king said, Behold, he is in your hand. For the king is not he that can do anything against you. So Zedekiah says, you guys do whatever you want. Kill him if you want. And then he says, I'm not going to resist you, and there's nothing I can do to stop you. Well, absolutely there is. Zedekiah had more power than these princes did. He could have absolutely said, no, leave him alone. We're not going to lift our hand against God's anointed. But instead he says, fine, do whatever you want. This is what Pilate did in relation to Jesus. I wash my hands of this situation. And no, you're responsible, Pilate, and you're responsible, Zedekiah. You could have stopped this from happening. So what do? Verse 6. Then took they Jeremiah and cast him into the dungeon of Malchiah, the son of Hamelech, that was in the court of the prison. And they let down Jeremiah with cords, and in the dungeon there was no water, but mire. So Jeremiah sunk in the mire. Now let me explain what this dungeon is. There were cisterns throughout Jerusalem that would catch water, and then the water would be used in households and so forth. There are still cisterns that are used throughout the world in poorer places and poorer locations, or perhaps locations that just don't have access to running water or power. And so a cistern is a large vessel that sits on the roof of a house or a building, and as the rain comes, it fills up that cistern. Now, cisterns could also be filled by irrigation means. In fact, that's how they're largely handled now. The cistern in your house will be filled by a truck, and then it's a gravity-fed water source, and you'd use the water in your cistern. Well, this cistern is no longer used, and it doesn't have any water in it, but they would use these cisterns as prisons or dungeons. And that's what these princes do with Jeremiah. They go take him out of the prison that Zedekiah was holding him in. They take him up to this rooftop, to this cistern, and they take ropes, and they put the ropes under his arms, under his armpits. So imagine if you were, you had these ropes under your arms, and you're holding onto the ropes, and they're lowering him down into this pit. Now, there's no water in the cistern, but there is mire. You know what mire is. We use that phrase, the muck and the mire. It's soil that has been thoroughly saturated with water, and it creates sort of a sticky mud. Remember when you were a kid and you might step into some mud, and then you go to pull your foot out, and your foot comes right out of your shoe or right out of your boot? That's muck or mire, and that's what's in the bottom of this cistern. So they lower Jeremiah down into it, and they lower him into the mire. And so this last phrase in verse 6 says this, so Jeremiah sunk in the mire. And literally that's what happened, but I also believe there's a spiritual application to that. You can sink in mire in your spirit, right? You can be down in the dumps. We might use that phrase here in the United States. Jeremiah, no doubt, not only is his body in the mire, I'm sure his spirit is in the mire. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. He was one that was a bit melancholy and sad and broken over what God's having to do in his nation. So it's understandable. I'm not criticizing him for that, but you know that his spirit is down. In fact, he's going to die in this cistern. And he's probably thinking, Lord, are you going to let me go out this way? Why would you let me die in this cistern? Now we get to our lesser-known personality here, Ebedmelech. Verse 7, now when Ebedmelech, the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs which was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon, the king, then sitting in the gate of Benjamin, Ebedmelech went forth out of the king's house and spake to the king, saying, my lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon. And he is like to die for hunger in the place where he is, for there's no more bread in the city. Then the king commanded Ebedmelech the Ethiopian, saying, take from hence 30 men with thee, and take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die. And this is where I say Zedekiah just has no backbone. He's got no spine. He doesn't know what he wants to do. Whichever group comes to him is the group that he just gives into. So the first group is the princes. Hey, king, we need to kill Jeremiah. Go ahead, do whatever you want. Then Ebedmelech shows up and says, King, we need to save Jeremiah's life. And he says, you're right. We should go save him. If someone else had come after him, I'm sure he would have said, yeah, go ahead and kill him again. There's just no principle with King Zedekiah. So Ebedmelech, he's an Ethiopian. He's not even a Hebrew. He's not a Jew, but he's serving the king. He's one of the king's eunuchs, so he's dedicated his life to serving this man. He heard that Jeremiah was put in the dungeon, and so he goes to the king on Jeremiah's behalf. So he's interceding. And the ministry of intercession is a wonderful ministry, and we all can have some part in it, where we go to someone on someone else's behalf, or perhaps we go to the Lord on someone else's behalf. We call that intercessory prayer. Verse 9 tells us that Ebedmelech makes his case. My lord the king, these men have done evil, and all that they've done to Jeremiah the prophet, that is true, they had, whom they have cast into the dungeon. And then he warns him, he is like to die for hunger in the place where he is, for there's no more bread. And Jeremiah would have died. No one was tending to Jeremiah. No one was paying attention to him. They lowered him into that cistern, into that mire, so that he could starve to death and die of dehydration. So the king tells Ebedmelech, go ahead, go get him out of there. And he sends 30 men with him. We only read, I think, of 4 princes in verse number 1. Let's go back to it. Shephatiah, Gedaliah, Jucal, and Pashur. Yeah, those 4 men are the ones who took him. So now the king tells Ebedmelech to take 30 men, go to that cistern, that dungeon, and pull out Jeremiah before he dies. Verse 11, so Ebedmelech took the men with him and went into the house of the king under the treasury, and took thence old cast clouts and old rotten rags, and let them down by cords into the dungeon to Jeremiah. And Ebedmelech the Ethiopian said unto Jeremiah, put now these old cast clouts and rotten rags under thine armholes, under the cords. And Jeremiah did so. So they drew up Jeremiah with cords, and took him up out of the dungeon, and Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. So Ebedmelech, before he goes to get Jeremiah, he goes down to the basement here. What does it say in verse 11? He went into the house of the king under the treasury, took these old cast clouts and rotten rags. So a bunch of old blankets, a bunch of old fabrics, and a bunch of old rags. Because he knows that this is going to be painful to Jeremiah. First off, he was already let down into the cistern by ropes under his arms. And so he's probably injured and sore and in pain, possibly even infected. We don't know. And so Ebedmelech, not only is he providing a rescue for Jeremiah, he's rescuing him in comfort at the same time. He brings these rags and these old blankets, and he throws those down to Jeremiah first. Actually, he lowers them down, I think is what the verse said. Let's see here. Took thence and, let's see. Oh, no. Thence cast, let them down by cords. Yeah, so he puts the rags and the blankets on the cords and lowers them down into the cistern. And he tells Jeremiah, put these underneath your arms, put them on the ropes, and then we're going to pull you up out of here. And Ebedmelech rescues Jeremiah from death. Now, we all know that God is the one who decides who lives, who dies, and when that occurs. And so God is using him, but thank God Ebedmelech was willing to be used. You and I have a responsibility to do right when we can do right. The book of James, I think it is, says, therefore to him that knoweth to do good, and doeth it not, to him it is sin. You and I have a responsibility to help people when we can help them. Proverbs encourages us to do that numbers of times. And Ebedmelech here, this Ethiopian eunuch working for Zedekiah, knew the message of Jeremiah was of God. And so he said, I need to do something. I can, and therefore I must. And he goes to the king on Jeremiah's behalf, pleads for Jeremiah's life. Then he's given permission to go and rescue him. And not only does he go and rescue him from death, he does so in a way that's gracious and helpful and comfortable and kind to Jeremiah. And so what a great example here. This man Ebedmelech, he doesn't get enough attention and credit, but God used this man to spare the life of Jeremiah. And that's one of the beautiful things we're seeing as we talk about these Bible people that aren't as well known. Very often they're instrumental in the lives of people who were very well known. So Jethro helps Moses, and Ananias helps Saul of Tarsus, who would become the Apostle Paul. We talked about we talked about Aquila and Priscilla, and they helped Apollos and Paul. And so here, Ebed-Melech spares the life of Jeremiah. What a great way to serve not only the individual, but God himself. All right, I'll leave you alone with that. Thanks so much for watching today. Hope that was a blessing to you. God bless you. We'll see you tomorrow.